So welcome everyone to this discussion of the digital closet with Alexander Monea and Shaka McGlotten. My name is Greg Newton. I am the co-founder with my partner Donnie Jochum of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division. And the Bureau is a government agency for a government that does not yet exist. And the service that we provide is holding a space for queer books and queer culture. So I'm coming to you, I'm Zooming from home, but the Bureau is located in Manhattan's LGBT, LGBT Community Center on West 13th Street. And we're open Wednesdays through Sundays from 1 to 7. And we stay open late when we have in-person events in the evenings. But we are doing a number of streamed events as well as in-person events again. So please check out our calendar. I'll put that in the link in a bit. I've already put a link in the chat so you can purchase Alexander's book from us if you like. And yeah, I'll also share our upcoming events calendar with you in a moment. But let's get started. I'm going to introduce our two speakers, and they're going to talk some. Alexander's going to read from the book and present, and then discuss a bit with Shaka, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A. So if you have questions, you can either put those in the chat function and I can read them, or I think we're a small enough group that you can unmute yourself and ask the question. So let's get started. So Alexander Monea is assistant professor serving jointly in the English department and cultural studies program at George Mason University, whose research focuses on the historical and cultural impact of computation and fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics. He is the author of The Digital Closet, How the Internet Became Straight from MIT Press, and co-author of a forthcoming book, The Prison House of the Circuit, A New Politics of Control from University of Minnesota Press. And Shaka McGlotten is professor of media studies and anthropology at Purchase College, SUNY, where they also serve as chair of the Gender Studies and Global Black Studies programs. An anthropologist and artist, their work stages encounters between Black study, queer theory, media, and art. They have written and lectured widely on networked intimacies and messy computational entanglements as they interface with QTPOC life worlds. So please welcome them both, and let's get started. Welcome.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Greg. Thanks to the Bureau for having us. It's been really enjoyable getting to look into the work that you're doing, and I'm so glad you all exist. Thanks to everyone for being here in the audience. Glad you were able to take the time out of your day to come chat with us. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the book for maybe 15 minutes. Then I'll turn it over to Shaka for some responses and some questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience for more general Q&A. So I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of background context of how the book came about. Then I'll read a little bit from the introduction and give you a breakdown of some of the chapters. So this book kind of has a funny history in that I didn't set out to write this book. It kind of found me. I was working on natural language processing algorithms in grad school. And when I graduated, it was in about my first or second year working at George Mason. I got invited to be on a panel with people that focused on visual studies and computation. And so I thought, computer vision algorithms were, similar enough that I could get a handle on them pretty easily. And I agreed to join them. And I was trying to think of an image recognition algorithm that wasn't terribly bad, right? Because most of the examples I could think of were, news stories of, computer image algorithms that thought like a school bus was a pumpkin, or a building was a rock, or things like that. And the one sector that I could think of where image recognition had gotten pretty good was detecting nudity, because I remembered when I was younger that anything that you typed into Google image search would eventually lead to porn, right? You could just type in like lawn chair, watermelon, right? Like the most banal things you could think of, and if you just scrolled far enough, you'd get porn. And somewhere in the teens, right, like that just stopped happening, right? You stopped just stumbling upon pornography in Google search results in the same way that you did in the aughts. And so I figured that'd be a good place to look at an image recognition algorithm and try to figure out, you know, what it's doing, how it's working, how it's thinking about the world. And as I dug into it, I just kept finding more and more heteronormative biases, and that sort of just led me down this rabbit hole. You know, I tried to publish it as a short article to get word out. That article is now in its like 8th round of revisions, and each time I got feedback, it would grow and grow and grow until I had this book. And that's sort of, you know, how this came about. It was like an accidental discovery, and then I just chased it down the rabbit hole. And every time someone would give me feedback, it would just grow to the point where it had to be a book instead of an article. So the book makes the case that there's a radical increase in anti-LGBTQIA plus censorship online. And I want to read to you from the introduction that's sort of setting out the case for this. And then I will give you sort of a breakdown of what comes in the individual chapters. And just fair warning, there is harsh language in this introduction, but it is not mine, it's Mark Zuckerberg's. So the book opens with a quote from Mark Zuckerberg that was leaked in some of his private messages from around 2010. And Mark Zuckerberg says, "I don't know why. They trust me, dumb fucks." And so I'm going to read to you from the introduction. "We don't use social media and other internet platforms because we trust them. Or at least nobody in my social circle seems to be such a dumb fuck, in the words of Facebook founder and CEO Mark Zuckerberg. We use such platforms despite a lack of trust because they are no longer opt-in systems. The structure of the contemporary economy and governance increasingly demands digital participation. We are generally aware that the cost of this participation is our privacy. We submit to ceding our privacy upon realization that participation is not optional, and that escaping the scope of digital surveillance is near impossible, even if participation were truly optional. But what if the costs are greater than a total loss of privacy? It's hard to imagine that the asking price for access to internet platforms could be higher, but it is. I'll be making the case throughout this book that the cost of admission also includes the continued marginalization of LGBTQIA plus communities and the amplification of misogyny and heteronormativity as they become automatically reproduced across the internet. This has both symbolic and material impacts on society. Decades of scholarship have demonstrated that representation in media matters, that public visibility helps determine our collective assessment of who matters, which issues are important, and what our obligations are as a society. It also has material impacts on members of the LGBTQIA plus community, like lack of access to health information, online community, online revenue streams, and the precarity of having to seek out things like dates, community, and customers offline. The rhetoric of Silicon Valley is filled with imagined inevitabilities. This is perhaps nowhere truer than in the rise of online content moderation. Billions upon billions of pieces of content are being uploaded to internet platforms every year. How could any individual, human or corporate, ever hope to keep up? Human nature can be brutish, hypersexualized, and vile. How can we hope to stem the deluge of offensive content reflective of these facts? In typical TED Talk fashion, we are asked to believe that there is only one solution, but the silver lining is it's a panacea: automated content moderation. By leveraging advanced machine learning and artificial intelligence techniques, the web can learn to police itself, and algorithmically organized humans can pick up any slack. In so doing, machines will be able to parse what we'll term sexual speech, a broad term meant to encapsulate all potentially adult content, from discourse about sex to sex education to pornography and other online sex work. However, a machine learning algorithm is only as good as its input data and training parameters. Unfortunately, when it comes to moderating sexual speech, the data is hopelessly flawed, and the parameters designed by Silicon Valley coders are not much better. They all contain heteronormative biases so severe it would be comical if it weren't so damn tragic. Our collective social discourse in the United States, particularly that which occurs online, contains rampant anti-LGBTQIA plus biases. Contrary to many popular narratives, these biases have increased in recent years. The Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation's annual Accelerating Acceptance report, conducted by the Harris Poll, states that radical declines in LGBTQIA+ acceptance occurred in the United States since 2016. The percentage of non-LGBTQIA+ 18 to 34-year-olds classified as allies, those who report being very or somewhat comfortable with queer individuals in all situations, dropped precipitously in the Trump era. Whereas 63% of the US population were classified as allies in 2016, that number dropped to 45% by 2018. And the total of male allies dropped from 62% to only 35%. Many of the most powerful internet platforms are based in the United States and are deeply impacted by these biases. The prejudices of a particularly vocal subsection of the population infect the training data, code, and coders behind automated content moderation to deleterious effects. The resulting algorithms end up over-scrutinizing, policing, and suppressing LGBTQIA+ discourse, including community forums, resources, outreach initiatives, activism, sex education, women's bodies, sex workers, and pornography. People targeted for algorithmic censorship have little recourse, while large vertically integrated corporations like mainstream hetero porn production companies, the types of San Fernando Valley companies that produce aggressively heterosexual, frequently misogynistic, and now almost exclusively gonzo or point of view porn may escape censorship. Niche content producers, on the other hand, ranging from LGBTQIA+ advocacy to feminist and queer pornography, are rarely so lucky. The result of this new regime of automated content moderation is what I call the digital closet. This term is meant to signify the ways in which queer individuals may be allowed to enter the digital public sphere, but only so long as they bracket and obscure their sexual identities. Their very being is so pornographied by automated content filters that they are largely barred from sexual expression online. To participate in our digital world, as is increasingly necessary today, requires a silence that is alienating and damaging. Any exit from the digital closet will be met with swift punishment. Queer people will find their content flagged and censored, their account banned or deprioritized and thus rendered invisible, will lose streams of online revenue, and will find the system weaponized against them by alt-right trolls looking to trigger all the aforementioned punishments. To add insult to injury, all of this will occur while tube sites like Pornhub operate walled gardens of heteronormative sexual expression, unhindered by the new platform economy. It seems as if a treaty has been made between the people in a moral panic over the proliferation of pornography and the internet platforms. And this treaty is at the expense of the queer community. Porn will be given a corner of the internet where it will flourish as long as it's not that kind of porn. So the rest of the introduction sort of sets up the book, right? So it outlines the ways in which we have this assumption that once the internet entered everybody's homes, the wave of pornography was unstoppable and people sort of gave up organizing against it. And one of the key themes in the book is demonstrating how this was never true. While it sort of escaped the limelight and didn't get media attention, people have consistently been organizing against pornography since the 90s and have had some signal victories over the years. It also works to outline some of the collateral damage from this war on pornography, which, as I mentioned, is a lot of non-pornographic but queer-oriented content, whether that's queer art, queer literature, community building discourse, activism, sex education, discourse about porn and about sexuality. All of this sort of stuff tends to get blocked and identified like as a false positive because these porn filters are set to be so sensitive that they lead to a lot of false positives. And the last part of the introduction tries to outline what heteronormativity even is, which funnily was the hardest part of the book, right? It's such a slippery concept, and I think nefariously so, because it sort of makes it invulnerable to critique and also allows it to adjust to different social, political, and cultural circumstances. And so trying to nail down what that looks like or how it works takes up a big part of the introduction. Chapter 2 is called Unlikely Bedfellows and traces the anti-porn alliance that's currently active in the United States and abroad, and putting pressure on the tech companies to institute policies, and also their discourse is sort of trickling into Silicon Valley, and you can see it reflected in the way that everyday coders in Silicon Valley talk about things like gender and sexuality, as well as in some of the policies that they're making. these unlikely bedfellows include evangelical Christian conservatives, anti-porn feminists, and now what for, I don't know, 4 years was called the alt-right. I think people are coming up with new terms for it now that might be more descriptive. And while the sort of alliance between anti-porn feminists and Christian conservatives that emerged in the 70s and 80s has been really well covered in historiographic accounts, the new edition of the alt-right is really what the book tries to track in this chapter, because that's really the discourse that is trickling into Silicon Valley, right? It gets intermediated by people like, I call him a pop psychologist Jordan Peterson in the book, right? Like they sort of serve as these translators between the like most extreme alt-right discourse online and, you know, everyday Silicon Valley coders. Chapter 2 looks at bias in the code itself. So it starts by looking at sort of the biased workplace in Silicon Valley, tracking industry polls and ethnographies from Silicon Valley to demonstrate some of the endemic misogyny and heteronormativity that goes on there. Before looking at how that sort of default bias that occurs in the workplace there tends to inflect the way that the companies are operating. So it takes a look at Google's development of safe search and the biases in the data sets that it's trained on and biases in the way that it actually operates online. And it also looks at Facebook's what Facebook calls its human algorithms, which are offshore content moderation laborers that, you know, are given on average 7 seconds and $1 an hour to determine what is or is not pornography for the internet. Chapter 3 takes a look at a lot of this collateral damage. One of the things that I've found frequently was that when someone would have their account shadow banned or would have an advertisement taken down or content taken down, they would be told that it was a unique instance, that it wasn't a sort of systemic practice on the web. So essentially, like, a lot of these people were getting gaslit. And so a big goal of the chapter is to stitch together hundreds of these examples to show that this is a pattern that's occurring across the web, and also to show how much it was amplified when the US Congress passed FOSTA SESTA in 2017 and really ramped up censorship across the internet. And then the last chapter of the book takes a look at pornography itself, and particularly it looks at 2 avenues through which I think pornography is increasingly heteronormalized online. The first is search features tend to only let you access pornography now if you use a very limited set of explicit keywords, right? If you are searching for porn on Google, you have to use the word porn or just like a small list of expletives that will bring it up. And what this essentially does is bottleneck the search feature for pornography and makes it easier to search engine optimize for it. And so large vertically integrated firms that have, you know, higher tech employees are able to capture more search results because it's bottlenecked at this point of just a few limited keywords. And then I also look at tube sites like Pornhub and Xhamster and places like that, where sort of the structure of the metadata that you tag your content with, right? So if you upload a video to Pornhub, you have to sort of tag what it's about and give it a title. And other researchers have started to find that the metadata tags that are available for tagging that tends to reinforce what gets produced on the site, right? Because you want to get views on your video, especially if you're trying to monetize it. And so you tend to make content that fits with the pre-existing metadata on the site so that it can surface in search results and become popular. And the metadata that a lot of these tube sites use also is profoundly heteronormative and exercises an influence not just on mainstream pornography, but on amateur pornography as well. And the other thing this chapter sort of adds is that, you know, I think a lot of us by the time we're in our 20s or 30s and like have a clearer sense of our identity and get better at navigating the web, get better at finding this stuff. But one of the main concerns I have is for young people where like it's their first go around searching for this stuff online, and the default is going to be that heteronormative porn is what they find, and they might not have the sort of internet skills to like get beyond that, because I know that there's this general myth that young people are great with technology, but teaching a lot of them in the classroom, I can tell you it's not really an actual truth, right? A lot of young people are really bad at finding resources online, really bad at using Google, really bad at navigating the internet. And so that's part of my concern, but that one's one of the hardest to substantiate because there's not a lot of, yeah, Shaka. That's one of the hardest ones to substantiate because there's not a lot of studies on adolescent porn usage in general, let alone on queer adolescents, and sort of what porn they're finding, when and where, and what impact it has on them. So one of the things I do call for is, more research like that to try to figure out sort of what it means and what it looks like to be at this young age browsing the internet for these types of things and what you're finding and what impact it has. And then the closing of the book just offers some really iterative or open possible solutions, right? So I recognize very clearly that this book has my perspective, right? As much as I've tried to avoid it, right? Like the end point is sort of my first ideas about where we could go from here, but I would really need lots of community input and democratic debate around figuring out what the right sort of organizing tactics are to go against this. And I'd be happy to talk about that with you all. And maybe you can come up with a lot better ideas than I have in my first stab at it in the book. So I'll turn it over to Shaka now for a couple responses. And I think Shaka has some questions they want to ask me, and I'm happy to respond to them. And then we'll turn it over to the audience for Q&A.
Thanks so much. And thanks, Greg, and everyone from MIT who helped make this event possible. I have questions, but I want to respond to just a few of the things that you said first. So, one, I think, well, first I'm going to say this is I don't really read a lot of manuscripts anymore because I am really busy and I'm really tired. And so, but when I got yours, I started reading Violet Blue's, preface, and I followed her work for decades. And then I was reading, and then I was halfway, I was just reading it before I paid attention to saying no. So I wanted to commend you also on just writing a book that is extremely accessible. It is not a book, it is, it's sophisticated, but there's nothing unnecessary in this book. I think you lay out a really clear argument, and I predict that this book is going to become a touchstone in studies of the queer net. So congratulations on the book, Alexander. Yeah. So, I think that one thing you talked about is a little bit about how challenging the concept of heteronormativity is, because it is it's the air we breathe. It's everything. I went, I always go back to, Lauren Berlant and Michael Warner's famous essay, Sex in Public, which even now I think it was published in '98 or something like that. It will still melt your whole brain reading it. They talked about heteronormativity as a system of institutions, structures, understandings, and practical orientations that privilege heterosexuality, even in contexts that have little visible relation to sexual practice. And so I remember famous examples of, his and her bathrobes, right? But in your case, you're dealing with porn, right? And one question I had while reading your book was, well, why are we talking about heteronormativity? Should we be talking about homonormativity as well? So I am curious, how you think about the relationship between heteronormativity as these sets of privileging structures and institutions, which I completely agree with in your argument, and how this has absolutely structured the entire internet. But how does this intersect, say, with discussions of homonormativity as well?
Thanks, Shaka. I think someone that does slightly different research might be better positioned to answer it, right? It's a good extension question for another project. I think that a lot of to give a more technical answer, I think that a lot of the sort of structures on the internet are set to sort of make normative distinctions amongst things, and to build sort of categorizations of things, and to capture sort of majoritarian social trends. And so I think that, you're always going to be in a battle against normativity when you're looking at sort of internet structures and algorithms. And so it's very easy to imagine, right? Like if this dragon gets slayed, that the next one that like comes to the fore for people is homonormativity as well, right? Or even that it's like of equal priority to this one to address. I think part of the issue is sort of building in democratic structures and regulatory bodies and sort of, you know, citizen oversight of these companies, so that you can sort of shift the normalization that's going on through these like algorithmic structures into directions that are at least more palatable socially, right? Or sort of cut them off if it's an area where like no normatization should be had, right? When it comes to like policing technology or credit technology, right? There you might just shut them all the way off. When it comes to like content recommendations, you know, you might decide that certain like norms need to be combated more than others, and you could sort of privilege which ones are you know, are being combated in the particular data sets and algorithms that you're training. So I think basically the answer is that like norms abound because of sort of the infrastructure of the internet. I think this one for me, I picked because I think that there's a particular mechanism for engaged action here, right? I think that there's a significant sort of groundwork built in terms of grassroots organizing around pushing for queer representation that could be brought to bear on Silicon Valley companies. And I also think because they take government money that they might be subject to Title IX, and so there might be legal avenues for pushing on them. So a lot of the focus in the book is also sort of based around me thinking about like what's a tactically tactical advantage point from which to push for sort of democratization of internet platforms and internet service providers. As far as like, I don't know, the structure of homonormativity online, I haven't spent as much time digging into it, to be honest. So I don't have as clear of an answer of sort of exactly how it's being reified or what it looks like in particular instances. But I mean, any algorithms that function like the ones I look at in the book are going to reinforce norms, and it's a matter of sort of which ones are acceptable or palatable socially to have reinforced.
So that was my bad asking a question about something that your book isn't about. But I do think it's interesting because, you know, when you talk about heteronormativity, and you also, you know, are citing Jane Ward's work on the tragedy of heterosexuality, you know, which I think is also very of the moment. That you're sort of talking kind of on two fronts. Like one, there are these, you know, social pressures, the sort of the social context of heteronormativity or the tragedy of heterosexuality that demand attention and, you know, undoing and challenge and everything else. And then you also have these industries, right, that are of course absolutely overlapped with and reproducing these systems. But I worry, or I don't know if worry is the right word, but, you know, I think about how in all the years, when you look at the data from the big tech companies, whether it's diversity data or the, you know, the details about sexual harassment, these are virtually unchanging.
Yeah.
Like, you know, 15, 20 years in, the data are virtually unchanging. There is something incredibly resilient about this, about these formations, right? And so when I think about like the queer internet, I think about Reddit, I think about 4chan, I think about Discord, I think about, you know, people pushing the boundary on Instagram. You know, I don't, you know, I feel that you're absolutely right? People, participation in certain of these platforms isn't really optional for a lot of people, but there is still a queer kind of world out there. And I guess maybe the question is, well, how do we protect them? Or as you say, are we going to organize to undo these other systems that seem so powerfully resilient to maintaining the momentum, their current momentum? And I don't know if you have a response or have you know, thoughts about that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, first off, I'd say, you know, questions that are about what the book isn't about are helpful to me, right? They they show me like how other people would approach the topic, where they would go with it, and also, you know, what might be fruitful to think about or collaborate on in the future. So, I mean, some of my, you know, most useful comments in the book have been comments on like, how does this intersect with this other thing that I don't know enough about yet, or that I, you know, didn't spend time researching. So those are always helpful. As far as, you know, sort of, I mean, this binary was in my mind the whole time I was writing this, Shaka, of like, there is a queer internet, right? And it is like, has some of these aspects that like, you know, that are sort of utopian, right? Like, and at the same time, there's this other huge chunk of the internet that's getting like over censored, especially as it gets concentrated into the hands of these like few platforms. And that tension is really hard to sort of hold in mind, right? Like, how can this be systematically happening across the internet while at the same time there's these enclaves that are carved out that are, I don't know, either partially safe or very safe for sort of queer discourse. And I think that, I mean, as far as what you do with that, I think the answer is, you know, you use those as a model for sort of what other spaces could look like. Because I think some of those spaces are like beautiful and productive and like offer a lot of stuff, not just to queer people, but to straight people, right? That's sort of why I bring Jane Ward into the book as well, right? And so I think that the model would be a sort of both and, right? Like definitely sort of protect and champion those spaces, but maybe also draw inspiration from them for what other spaces could look like, and, you know, maybe use the that inspiration to sort of energize people to sort of put pressure on other platforms. I don't know, maybe one at a time, maybe collectively. You know, I'm an academic, so I have less experience of on the ground organizing, and this is where like I would bow to the wisdom of people that, you know, have done this better and more often than I have, to sort of figure out what the tactics ought to be.
I mean, when you look at like recent organizing, like sex worker organizing related to OnlyFans in the last, you know, couple of years, you definitely see, you know, the common kind of pattern is that really the only thing that will work is like enough public attention, like, and embarrassment might get companies to do certain things, right? But it is hard to, given that we're in the midst of another cresting wave of like an anti-queer moral panic that has been going on for my entire life, right? Like I turn 47 tomorrow, like, and since I was, you know, like, what's her face, Anita, what's her face from Florida was already like at it in, you know, by the time I was like, you know, 5 years old, you know, and it's the same cresting wave. So when I think about these moral panics, I think about them also against the rising kind of social awareness, or the kind of, whether performative or not, of companies who during Black Lives Matter, in other ways, are kind of taking very different stances than when they would pull advertising dollars from, you know, like when Ellen did her first kiss or something, right? Mm. So we're in this moment of these really like crazy juxtapositions. And we're also in a moment where the internet is fractured. There are many different, you know, internets. There isn't one internet. You know, there's a Russian internet now. There's a Chinese firewall. There's, you know, like we talked, you know, I already said, you know, Discord, 4chan, you know, Reddit. There are these kinds of multiplicities. So these questions of organizing, I think, are really important. And there's a history of it, right? But how do we do it in this context? And I think your final thought about doing the research is the thing that I think about that, and I would totally do that research if I could. But, you know, doing research in the US, like I'm in Berlin right now, but like doing research in the United States with kids about sex, about queer sex, it's like you're just asking for it, you know, like, you know, I had a colleague, Mary Gray, you may know her. She wrote a pretty famous book called Out in the Country. Mm-hmm. About media and queer youth. And, you know, she described to me how, you know, she'd gotten, you know, permission to do this field work for her book. And when she wanted to do a follow-up interviews, she couldn't get it, even though it was the same project, even though some of those minors were now were now adults, she couldn't get the permission. So we're in a kind of, you know, we think about living in a sexually libertine era but we're in an incredibly sexually conservative era where you can find your queer suburb, you know. And it's the question, how do we protect those spaces? How, can we expand them? Are we going to be militant queers? Are we going to fight IRBs to get permission to, you know, do research to talk to kids about their porn use? I think these are really important questions.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one thing I'd add, Shaka, is also like, I mean, so there's maybe three issues, right? It's not just like protecting and expanding the sort of queer spaces that exist and pushing on platforms to sort of, you know, change their behavior and, you know, stop their bias censorship. There's also, for me, and this touches on the research with kids, of like, how do you funnel people that need to be there into those queer spaces so that they don't have to spend so much time like cut off or with that sort of information and community inaccessible to them? Because, you know, and I mean, your research probably touches on this as much or more than mine, but like the almost universally, I saw people talking about how important that sort of online community was for them, especially if they were in a rural area or had a conservative family or were in a particular type of school or place, right? And I think that, you know, that's for me another key issue is like, how do you at least make those queer spaces findable for youth, right? So that they, you know, can get information and explore their sexuality safely and, you know, things like that online earlier, right? Less, you know, I don't know, less being separated, less being alone, right? And that's, I think part of the research could be that, but maybe there's also, you know, ways to do that without needing IRB approval in studies, right? Like maybe there's ways to make it more visible or to have channels or pathways that are more findable. Because I don't know, I want to believe that it's easily locatable, but then I watch my students try to find anything online, and I could just see so many people getting stuck and not finding what they need.
Kit has an interesting question, but that I want them to elaborate. But before maybe we go to questions, I am interested, you know, based on what you said, I'm thinking, of course, of Tumblr and how, you know, when Tumblr changed its rules, you know, there were people lost it, you know, that people had grown up on Tumblr, people had, you know, learned so much about themselves, they had been able to put themselves out to the world, and then people went to Twitter, and now Mr. Musk. So how do you think, like, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think that in spite of his supposed libertarianism, that you think, do you have any like gut reactions or gut thoughts about his acquisition of Twitter and what it's going to do to, because a lot of the Tumblr people went to Twitter, though it doesn't have obviously the same affordances, but like what's going to happen? Are there going to be Twitter refugees going somewhere else?
I think the sort of migratory path is the permanent one, Shaka, right? Because I mean, from what I've seen, any sort of new platform or platform that's in disarray will sort of either, I mean, I see this as much with sex workers as well, right? Like any platform that doesn't have a like user base or a niche will like take on sex workers or take on queers or take on a marginalized group to sort of grow itself and gain network effects. And then when it sees an opportunity to grow and become a like mainstream network, it'll kick them off, right? Like this is 100, like I very sadly was predicting this with OnlyFans since it came out, right? Like they're never going to be able to be in the Google App Store or the iOS App Store if their main content is pornography, right? They're going to use sex workers to grow until they can become a mainstream streaming platform. The same way Twitch did that with gamers, right? It's sort of the business model. So I wouldn't be surprised if this sort of refugee status you're talking about is just like permanent, where you sort of move from one platform to the next, you know, because people see a way to gain a bigger audience by kicking you off. As far as like Musk, I think it's going to be really weird and interesting and probably terrible to see what he's doing, right? Because he took on like 25 billion in loans to buy the company, and from what I've seen from people online, the debt financing alone on the amount of loans that he took out is more than Twitter brings in revenue each year right now. So like he's going to have to really ramp up revenue. And I think that will, I mean, in some ways constrain him, right? Because for all his sort of big talk, he's not willing to burn money, right? Like he offered to give $6 billion if people could explain how it would end world hunger. They sent him a detailed proposal and he just ignored it, right? So like he's not going to just like throw money away. So I think he will be somewhat constrained by sort of the financial imperatives of Twitter, but I think his main course of action is just going to be to let trolls back on in various guises, and that will be, you know, a really sort of hard thing to deal with for you know, an increasing queer community on Twitter.
Yeah, I can't even with Twitter. Like I really can't even. I pretty much stay away from. I'm basically like I'm just like on TikTok these days, just very happy on TikTok.
Yeah,
you know, hoping for some gray sweatpants, but usually just with other funny videos. There are some really good questions in, and I mentioned Kit's, but there was also Claudia's before that. So I'm just gonna turn those, the rest of this over, Alexander, to you, and you can, you know, and if I have more to say, I'll unmute myself, but I want to give the audience time to engage as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Shaka. That was awesome. All right, so Greg, should we be letting people unmute to ask their questions, or you just want me to read them from chat?
Why don't you read them from chat if they're already here, and then if people want to unmute later, they can.
Okay, so I'll talk about Claudia's first. Claudia says, the hate speech, Measuring Hate Speech project at UC Berkeley is benefiting from the book. Renata is extending this work and labeling image content. Do you have advice for us in terms of categories of queer visual language? We combine Qualtrics surveys with Mechanical Turk to label and train alternative algorithms that come from diverse perspectives, queer, BIPOC, other marginalized communities. Claudia, this would be something I would want to think about, and maybe like Shaka also could, you know, throw in some ideas later on. If you email me or at me on Twitter or something, I would love to talk in depth about this and try to figure out, you know, what might work. And also maybe there's other collaborations, because like right now, one of my goals after the book is I mean, so one of the things that I faced when trying to write the book was that the archive for this book is really ephemeral, right? Like people sort of post an Instagram story or like a TikTok or something about their content getting taken down, or a tweet, but then their account goes private, or the like message gets deleted, or they like delete their account or things like that. And so trying to find any sort of systemic record of like what was getting censored, where and why was really hard. And so I also, like, moving forward, really want to find partners to build a sort of data structure and interface where people can report that their content was taken down and sort of report for why, and we can collect metadata on that, so that we could produce maybe some more quantitative analyses that, you know, would maybe be taken more seriously in Silicon Valley. I mean, I doubt it, but you know, one can hope. I mean, just having some like sort of quantitative insights would be really nice as well. And so I'd also love to chat about that maybe, and see if you all have any suggestions for how to go about getting that started.
Yeah, I would love that. Our work has been going on now for about 4 or 5 years, and we have what we argue is the most sophisticated measurement algorithm for hate speech that actually takes into account sort of multifaceted dimensions and uses item response theory and combines that with deep learning. And so, and of course, we've worked with every social media company, and it's been, I'll just call it out, total bullshit, you know, the way that they've like treated us. And frankly, we've also worked with some large advocacy organizations that I think are more interested in censorship than they are in freedom of speech. And as a political refugee in this country from Bolivia, and as a queer person myself, and there's other queer folk and BIPOC folk on the team, we're much more interested in freedom of speech and thinking about how our communities are being further marginalized and silenced than we are in terms of like additional social controls. But myself and the lead author, Chris Kennedy, along with Renata Barreto Montenegro, who's here, and the other team members. We've invested, more than $100,000. We've, have like gained some momentum, but as you know, from what I can tell, it's very difficult to get traction if what your goals are counter, sort of monetizing and really trying to create something different. So since we're about to embark on another round and we're going to get a little spendy with it, not at the same proportion, because we already, are working from the past work. Yeah, it would be amazing to further work with you, and Renata is the expert here in terms of her legal. She's she's finishing her doctorate and also is a legal scholar. But this is all really wonderful to hear, and I'm so thankful to the Bureau as well. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Claudia. I'd love to keep in touch and talk often. And I think that, my experiences are the exact same, right? Like if you're working in any sort of ethical domain, the only thing they want from you is the rubber stamp that what they're already doing is fine. Anything else is generally ignored. All right, I have a question from Kit, if they want to unmute and talk a little bit about your question about transformative restorative justice.
Yes, hi everybody. My name is Kate Emmerich. My pronouns are they and or she. I am hailing from Boston, Massachusetts. And I am in a boot camp called Code Squad, and I am also outside of that a global restorative and transformative justice practitioner. So I bring up the question of restorative and transformative justice as a way to shift the paradigm and be able to shift power, being able to say, between collective groups of people or individuals themselves, how can we restore each other, right? How can we work on building more interconnectivity between us to be able to switch to transformative justice, which is stopping the violence, because online censorship is violence. Blocking sex workers from access to their money is violence. Suppressing trans and BIPOC voices and other queer voices is violence. And how do we transform those conditions so the violence never happens again? Or at least in the meantime, until we get to that point, how can we work on active harm reduction and being able to expand on that? So it's more of a question of how can we just start radically envisioning and committing to these values and also implementing that in our work wherever that sphere lands. And I just want to thank y'all for the space and time in honoring my question.
Thanks so much, Kit. So I can outline for you sort of, again, what were provisional ideas that I came up with, right, in the book. And I'd love to hear from you and other people about, additions or how they could be pushed in different directions. So sort of similar to what you were talking about, Kit, I divided them up into what I saw as like revisionist responses. And these are kind of like plugging a hole in a sinking ship. It's not going to solve the problem. It's going to be a fight that just keeps recurring over and over again, but they might have some harm reduction in the short term versus sort of revolutionary changes, which I think are more longer term and could potentially move towards a more lasting solution. The shorter term and more revisionist things that I think could help would be organizing collectively to push for non-censorship commitments from companies, building sort of better public accountability projects where you collect data and produce the sorts of headlines. I think Shaka was talking about this, about how the PR crisis and the cost that the money that you have to spend to put out a PR fire is one sure way to get a company's attention. And so sort of building sort of public mechanisms to produce that sort of narrative and get it into the press, I think is another good sort of short-term solution that we already know how to do. I think initiating better sort of public discourse and building discussions with each other about sort of what censorship is and what obscenity is and like how we think it ought to operate, where the line is, if there is one, for like what should be visible and to whom. I think those are conversations we just haven't had in a long time. And so the default norms that a lot of people have are very outdated and aren't really in line with any sort of empirical evidence we have, any sort of evidence we have from queer studies or from, adolescent psychology or things like that. So, building sort of space for community discourse, I think, is helpful. I think you can do things like demand, not just transparency, but explainability for AI so that, citizens can better engage with these companies and build, critiques. So anything pushing for, transparency and accountability, I think can help. It's not a panacea, but, it can make it easier to sort of generate the PR fires they have to put out, as well as like better adjudication mechanisms for people that are getting shadow banned, getting kicked off of platforms. I think those could be advocated for in the short term that might help. I think the longer term stuff, Kit, is where it like gets a lot vaguer, right? Because it's so contextualized to like the specific arena of struggle and the like people that are active in it. But some of the things that I thought about were, I think that a lot of the harm in the book that I trace out in the material world that comes about from this sort of online violence is partially connected to the like criminal justice system and the way that it sort of makes it difficult to be a sex worker and criminalizes it in a lot of ways. And so I think that there's a significant connection here between sort of the movement I'm thinking of and Black Lives Matter and like defunding the police arguments, as well as sort of things around legalizing sex work online and off and making it sex like concern for the social welfare state, right? So making it truly optional, making it legal, and making it so that, sort of the issues that occur online don't sort of lead to, bodies in the streets, right? Which was really the narrative that was happening after Fosta Sesta, when so many people got permanently deplatformed and had to, go out and take strangers and do all cash transactions again. Also, when you push me, I start thinking about things like the public utility model. I don't really think a few billionaires should control internet platforms this large. And so things like making communications infrastructures, public utilities is interesting to me, as would be other things about like reparative stuff democratically, so that our regulatory bodies and our legislators are actually accountable to citizens, so that we have some sort of check on these systems, which is really like the longest term, biggest project, right? Like, how do you make it so that you're supposed to have a government that can stand in like contrast to these like billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar companies and sort of push them to behave in accordance with their citizens, but we don't have that here. And so I think that would be another long-term transformative solution. But Kit, you can email me if you don't want to unmute. I'd love to hear more ideas if there are, and to aggregate them, because it's a really hard thing to try to plan out ahead of time. And really, I just want ideas to inspire people to, like, I don't know, maybe get started.
I think, I believe this was from Miriam Kaba, or maybe Adrienne Marie Brown, but actually like just taking like transformative justice and like practicing that and actually starting to having these, real life conversations with one another and also like across the world is so imperative. It's so imperative because then we all can start thinking, how can we shift collectively together versus being pushed out and isolated in all these other pockets and still not being heard. So yes, I left my email in the chat and more than happy to connect further and talk about TJ and RJ.
Thanks so much, Kit. All right, so
I have a question. Hey, Alex.
Yeah. Hey.
Hey, just curious how you received the Twitter Elon news and whether having, Twitter owned by an eccentric individual could be accretive at all, or if it's all just going to make things worse and more opaque and even more of a cesspool.
I mean, I definitely think it'll make things worse. How much worse is up for debate. Like I said, the debt financing that he's going to have to handle for the company, I think is a somewhat of a handcuff on what he can do. And also, I don't know, I think there's this issue of sort of like a Western, like particularly an American media filter bubble, where like everyone in the American media is on Twitter, and so they think that Twitter is the world, whereas like Twitter is pretty small and like most people aren't on it. And so like the impact that changes on Twitter have on the internet is hard to say, because like almost anything that you read is either from someone that is like, they think Twitter is the whole world, or they've just like don't care at all about Twitter. It's hard to find that like medium space where like you can recognize that Twitter is important for some people in some places, but not for everyone. So like the sort of estimations that you read about it, I think are either like way overblown or way undersold. Like I said in response to Shaka, I think that he'll let more trolls back onto the platform and make some of their behavior more permissible. I think he'll be constrained in some of that, but it will still make life miserable for a lot of people. And it's not as if, you know, they ever successfully removed all the trolls. But we'll see. I don't know. Twitter's a weird company, and they don't really do a lot of stuff right. And so I don't know what will happen when you throw in the chaos of you know, someone that thinks they're a genius, but is, you know, only spending like 1/10 of his time there trying to run the company into the mix. All right, I've got more in the chat. I have Joshua Goodstein, yeah, agrees that Twitter's going to get worse. Alexander Hall. What are your thoughts on the top, as in most practical, likely to be adopted governance practices that queer and other marginalized communities could benefit from? Alexandria, I think I answered that in part in response to Kit's question. If you want more on that, or if you think if there's like a direction I didn't go in, feel free to type it in chat or unmute and I'll look at it more. From S. Chung, where do you think the inflection point is for how platforms transition from safe avenues for marginalized groups' self-expression versus how they transition into catering to mainstream and therefore dangerous platforms for the marginalized? Or even the difference between those open platforms that began as safe and then transitioned versus platforms that were never so safe to begin with? Is it in the design of the platform itself that is susceptible to mainstreamification, user profile centered versus forum centered, or in the ways it is moderated, early days of Reddit, for example, versus how it exploded shortly after, or something else? So I think that this is a really hard question to answer succinctly, right? Because you do have this model of like some platforms sort of being troll heavy from the beginning, because they're sort of designed as safe spaces for like anonymous trolling, like 4chan or even worse, 8chan. Whereas you have some other places that are sort of taken over by queer refugees because they, you know, present as sort of a platform that not a lot of trolls are on yet, or that have sort of the features that they want to share the sort of content they want. As far as like, so the beginning part I think is going to be highly variable and contextual. I don't know that you could predict ahead of time sort of what features of a platform are going to lead to like it being adopted as queer, or being ignored, or being adopted as I mean, you could predict that it would be adopted by sort of trolls if there's anonymity and like, you know, no content moderation. But other than that, it's hard to sort of predict what a platform will do. The mainstreamification, I think, is the more stable route, right? Because as they want to reach more audiences, they become you know, more dependent on advertising revenues and more at the whims of advertisers, and more sort of trolls see the platform as like a space to get attention and to like stage stunts. And also they need to like go through the bottleneck of the app stores, which tends to like really make them crack down on their you know, community terms and conditions. Even if it's something like what Reddit or Twitter does, where they don't let you see a huge chunk of the like platform when you're accessing it via mobile. So I don't know. I think that answers some, but it's like, I don't know, that could be a whole book that I would also love to read answering that sort of question. All right, I've got Isabel. In regards to collective organizing, I've been involved in sex worker activism on these issues for the last 2 years, and this is the first event I've encountered out of any other community addressing these subjects. It's felt very lonely, and it's a shame considering the ways in which censorship impacts so many other marginalized people. Can you share what other communities you have encountered who are active or becoming active on these issues? I mean, I think that there's a significant amount of sort of Black organizers in the US that are working on issues that are similar enough that like strong coalitions could be built. I don't know that I've encountered like another sort of group in the US that I've seen sort of organizing in the same way for sort of similar issues. If other people have sort of ideas or have seen stuff that Isabel might also be referred to, I'd love to hear about it in chat.
And Alex, I know we're at time, and I don't want to keep you and Shaka longer than you agreed to. So I'm happy to send you the chat so that you can respond to folks at your own leisure.
Thanks, Greg. And I mean, I'd also say just anyone that's watching this, you've got my email. You can at me on Twitter. I'm, happy to chat, especially if you have ideas or questions or examples or things like that.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Alex, and thank you so much, Shaka. This has been really enlightening and very interesting, and I'm looking forward to finishing the book. And thanks everybody who joined. Thanks all who made a donation or bought the book from us. We really appreciate it. And if you are in New York, please stop by the Bureau. We are located inside the LGBT Community Center on West 13th Street, and we're open Wednesdays to Sundays from 1 to 7. So I hope to see you all in person soon or at our next online event. Have a good one. Bye all.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, Alexander.
Okay.